So, last session we saw how data is important in terms of understanding the working of an economy, and we try to understand the economy in terms of production, consumption, distribution, as well as resource allocation. Today what we shall do is to try and see some formal theories in terms of behavior of consumers as well as analyzing markets in an economy. When I say markets, what we shall do today is to see a typical market. Yeah? From here, we might actually extend our analysis to different types of markets later on. So, this is an introduction or a prelude to such an analysis. Okay. Now, let us start with a basic theory building in terms of how consumers behave. Now, the principal assumption upon which the theory of consumer behavior as well as market demand is built is that a consumer has very limited resources available, yeah, in terms of income, money income that is available, and the consumer has or would be interested to allocate this limited income among available goods and services to maximize his or her utility. Yeah, and I put in other terms satisfaction otherwise. Yeah. So, the consumer's problem then is to utilize this resources that are available to a variety of goods and services which he or she would like to consume. That's a kind of a resource allocation problem as far as consumer is concerned. Now, this is extremely important in terms of understanding the demand side of the market and from there to understand the demand side of the economy. Okay, let us go in a very step-by-step manner in terms of understanding what is the theoretical foundation for this demand analysis. The concept with which we begin today is the concept of utility itself, because utility is the amount of satisfaction derived from the consumption of a commodity. Yeah? And consumption then is a function of this utility. Yeah? We talked about a lot of examples in our previous session in terms of how a typical household consumption basket varies across income groups. This variation across income groups is because of the fact that consumer assigns different utility or different levels of satisfaction across various consumption baskets. Okay. We also know that this whole concept of satisfaction of utility is a very subjective concept. Yeah? And the differences in satisfaction across consumers are vastly different. So, we need to have a common denominator to measure that. And that's a big problem because, there is no standard common denominator with which we can measure this, or there is no units with which we can measure this. Hypothetically, let us take for the sake of convenience that utility can be measured in utils. Yeah? So, utils is a unit for measuring utility. Then our task becomes slightly easier because a consumer would measure utility in terms of utils across different consumption baskets and then allocate the income accordingly. Okay, let us push this argument a little forward. If we are to understand the concept of utility then within this framework of that there is some unit called utils, then there are two approaches to understanding that. That is the cardinal utility theory and the ordinal utility theory. Okay. Now, what is the difference between these two? Well, in the cardinal utility approach, utility is measurable in a cardinal sense. What do I mean by cardinal cells? That is, we can assign values for utility. That is, 100 utils can be derived from eating a slice of bread. 200 utils can be derived from having a cone ice cream. Yeah. So, that is the cardinal approach. That is, I repeat, that we can assign values for utility. In the ordinal utility approach, well, as the term itself denotes, it is measurable in an ordinal sense. What does that mean? It means that we cannot, we don't assign values. Instead of that, we can actually rank our preferences. Yeah. And once when we rank preferences, we know our preferred choices. So, which should come first is coming as a priority or a preference in our schedule then. Yeah. Okay. So, if I enjoy eating more ice creams, rather if I derive more utility from the consumption of ice creams, then my preference for ice creams over a slice of bread will be stated in my commodity basket that I am consuming. Yeah. So, two broad approaches, the cardinal utility approach and the ordinal utility approach. Okay. Now, let us take a closer look at each one of this. Yeah, it's a very simple concept because from here we can build in terms of a demand curve and a market demand curve. That's why. Now, cardinal utility approach was actually put forth by economists of 19th century, and they assumed that, well, utility is measurable. Yeah, and there is a unit. For anything to measure, we need a unit. Okay, which means that the difference in between two measurement is in terms of a very significant numerical value. Okay. What do I mean by that? What I mean is that suppose I am consuming two commodities, X and Y. Yeah, the utility which I derive, yeah, from consumption of X can be put as a function of X, how much I am consuming and the satisfaction that I am deriving. And I have another commodity that I am consuming Y, and the utility that I am deriving from that is a function of how much I am consuming of Y. Then I will decide which one is giving me maximum utility. Okay, but that is not a unilateral decision that I can take for two reasons. Reason number one, I have limited income or I have limited resources with which I have to fulfill this consumption. So, I have to allocate these limited resources. Reason number two, this allocation of resources is a function of prices. Yeah? Some commodities have higher price and some commodities have lower price. So, I do the allocation in terms of prices as well as the income that I have. Okay. Now, the cardinal approach then argues that, well, there is a concept called marginal utility. And we will look at the marginal utility of consumption and then look at the prices of commodities and then allocate my resources and arrive at a decision in terms of what I should be consuming. Let me explain this. What is this marginal utility? Okay. Now, let us start with both the concepts. There is a concept called total utility and then there is a concept called marginal utility. Okay. Total utility is nothing but the overall satisfaction derived from consuming a good or a service. Yeah, overall, I have a bundle of satisfaction, that is in our earlier example 100 utils from the consumption of a slice of bread. Okay. Now, marginal utility is nothing but the additional satisfaction that an individual derives from the consumption of an additional unit of good or services. Okay. Why do we emphasize this? We emphasize this because in real life situations, a number of our decisions are taken at the margin. Yeah. Remember, we talked about a concept called opportunity cost earlier. Yeah. That is, there is a trade-off in terms of resource utilization. Yeah. And that is the opportunity cost. Okay. Now, if we are thinking about opportunity cost, then a lot of our decisions are decisions that are taken in the margin. Yeah, that is, I can use this resource for something else, but if I am going to use the resource for a particular consumption of a good or service, then I will value it at the margin. So, marginal decisions are very important, and in our daily lives, almost all our decisions are taken at the margin. So, marginal utility then is this additional satisfaction that an individual derives from the consumption of an additional unit of good or service. So, what is that? Change in total utility in terms of change in the quantity consumed. Yeah. So, I consumed 3 slices of bread, yeah, and I have 300 utiles from that. Will the 4th slice of bread increase my utility, or will it remain same, or will it decrease my utility? We don't know. Yeah. So, that consumption decision of the 4th slice of the bread is the marginal concept that I am talking about, and that I would equate in terms of the change in total utility because of this change in consumption that I am having. Yeah. So, this deltas, yeah, delta TU is the change, yeah, and delta Q is the change in consumption. Okay. So, what are we assuming here? We are assuming here that every additional unit of consumption would give you certain utilities. 1. 2. We don't know whether this additional unit of consumption is adding to your utility or is it leading to a decline in your utility. Yeah, that's why this decision is very important. Okay. Now, in this approach, then we have a very interesting kind of a possibility that comes. That is nothing but the law of diminishing marginal utility. Yeah. The law of diminishing marginal utility states that as more and more of a good is consumed, the process of consumption will reach a particular point where it yields smaller and smaller additions to utility. Yeah? Okay. Let me take a minute to explain this. When I consume my first unit or first slice of bread, remember I am hungry and I am going to consume my first slice of bread, the utility that I get from that is very high. Second slice of bread, well, okay, good, I am happy. Third, I am almost full. Yeah. When I go on consuming more and more slices of bread, well, the total utility reaches a maximum point. Beyond that, it can't increase because I am full now. Yeah. At that point, marginal utility is 0. So, we stop consumption. If we are not stopping consumption at that point, then marginal utility actually becomes negative. That's not good. Yeah. And that's a problem of overconsumption. A lot of our decisions, sometimes are at the margin, as I keep saying, but are taken into account of this possibility of negative marginal utility. Yeah. So, Cardinal Approach then states that there is a law of diminishing marginal utility, that as more and more of a good is consumed, in this process of consumption, the consumer would reach a particular point where the additional units of consumption would actually yield smaller and smaller utility. It becomes 0 and it could actually become negative. Let me just put up an example for this. Yeah. So, I have purchased 5 units of a commodity here, and I have utility derived from the consumption of these 5 units. Yeah. First unit when I consume, I have 4 units of utility. Yeah, and that is the total unit utility, and the marginal is also that because only 1 unit is consumed. Yeah, the del is not from 0 to 1, it's only 1. When I consume the second unit, well, my total utility increases from 4 to 7. Yeah, there is an increase, which means that my marginal utility is from 4, it has become 7. So, the del in my earlier expression is 3 here. That is a change in the total utility. Yeah. So, remember the definition of marginal utility is that the change in total utility from an additional unit of consumption. Okay. I go on, yeah, I consume 3 units, 4 units, 5 units. Yeah. When I reach 3 units, my total utility is 8. Yeah. Beyond that 3 slices of bread, my example, beyond that I can't really eat. Yeah. But I take 1 more slice. Again, there is no increase in total utility. Then my marginal utility becomes 0. Once when this is the point when I should actually be stopping. Once when marginal utility becomes 0, I should stop consumption. If I am not stopping consumption, then I reach a point where my total utility is actually declining, which means that marginal utility is becoming negative. Yeah, and that is shown in this graph. Initially, the total utility is increasing, then it reaches a point where actually it is plateauing, and after that it slightly falls, and the marginal utility curve is mapped in line with the total utility, and then after a point it becomes negative. Yeah, okay. Now, I think this concept then is pretty straightforward, because we can relate it easily with food consumption. Yeah, the first slice of bread, my example, actually makes it clear in terms of how much we can consume, and we cannot push food consumption beyond a point. Okay. Now, the idea then is that, well, after a point, marginal utility starts falling. Yeah, and there is a principle of diminishing marginal utility. That is, as more and more goods are consumed, the process of consumption will at some point yield smaller and smaller additions to utility, and that's a real life phenomenon. We don't need much of an explanation for that. Okay, so then we can actually find a point where the consumer is in equilibrium. Yeah, that is, so far we have assumed that any amount of good or service are always available for consumption, but that's not correct. Why? Because we have two constraints. That is, remember we talked about income as well as prices. Yeah, prices are actually determined in the market. Income is actually fixed for the consumer. So there is a limitation in terms of the consumer's income. So consumer has limited income or budget, as well as the goods obtained are at a market price. Now, how will the consumer then allocate this income across commodities? Yeah, remember, consumption basket, there is a basket of commodities that the consumer is consuming. Yeah, I am not going to stop my consumption only with one good. No, in real life we consume so many things. So let us consider two goods, X and Y. Okay, let us also consider that prices of X and Y are fixed. Time being, when I go to market, I know that this is the price. That's the consumption thing that we are talking about. We also know that the income of a consumer is given at a particular point in time. There is no variation. Okay. So there is an optimizing condition which we can derive. That is, consumer would be reaching a kind of an equilibrium point in consumption when marginal utility from a commodity X, yeah, by the price of X is equal to the marginal utility of another commodity Y by the price of Y. Rather, the ratio between marginal utilities and prices is used to have an equilibrium in the market, and that is a condition where the consumer derives maximum kind of satisfaction or utility. Okay, so it's a very simple kind of an expression. What am I trying to do here? I am trying to do here only one small thing, that if you are having prices that are given to you, and if incomes are also given to you, then you will allocate the resources in terms of the available prices of goods and services. Okay, and the decision is taken by taking into account the marginal utilities. So a consumer would then equate marginal utilities to price. Okay, suppose I have to make a decision in terms of consuming apples and oranges. Yeah, and let us also assume that prices of apples are more than that of oranges. Yeah, so but I want to consume both. I like both. That's the basic problem of a consumer. Yeah. Now, I would actually equate price of apple to the marginal utility from consuming an additional unit of apple to the price of orange and the marginal utility from the consumption of an additional unit of orange. And then I will decide whether I should consume 2 apples and 1 orange, or 2 apples and 5 oranges. Yeah, that is the equilibrium that we are talking about. Okay. Now, one straightforward explanation that we can draw from this is that we will spend on particular goods which actually gives maximum marginal utility with lesser price. Yeah. So, if the marginal utility of X in terms of its price is higher, then we will spend more money on X and less money on Y. Yeah, I think that's the kind of a decision which as consumers we make every day when we go to the market. We look for the price and then we will decide whether should I buy more of a good or less of a good. I'm just formalizing it in terms of some expressions here, that's all. Now, moving to the ordinal approach. Ordinal approach is another group of economists, yeah, who believe that, well, utility is measurable only in an ordinal sense. That is, you can only rank your preferences, yeah, because there is no unit with which we can measure utility. So, utility then is derived from the consumption of a good, okay, such as X, for example, which is a function of the quantities of X and Y consumed by a consumer, yeah, because a consumer is consuming different goods, right. So, there is an overall utility which we want to maximize, that is a function of each of this good that is consumed, okay. Now, the ordinal utility theory argues that, well, utility is a qualitative concept, you cannot attach a quantitative value to that. So, you can only list your preferences, yeah, and these preferences can be ranked and you can actually plot a curve out of these preferences, which we would call as the indifference curves. I will come to that in a minute. Now, what is the basis for such a ranking of preferences? The basis for such a ranking of preferences is that there is this concept of rationality, yeah. What is that? Consumers are rational and consumers would use maximum available information and then arrive at a decision. Okay, put it in simple terms, what does it mean? Before purchasing a product, we might ask 5 different sellers what is the price of that. What am I doing there? I am actually gathering information about price there. Then I will decide whether I should consume or not. That is the notion of rationality that I am talking. Yeah, I am not going blindly and purchasing something. We would call such kind of consumers as a little irrational consumers, right? So, rational human beings will choose to maximize their utility by selecting highest possible utility with their available resources. Yeah, that is an upper limit. Given this upper limit in terms of income, they will choose what is the maximum utility that I can achieve. Okay. So, different consumers then will have different utilities. So, different individuals will have different preferences, and that is exactly what we saw yesterday when we were looking at the consumption basket of different income groups. Recall our yesterday's discussions in terms of 3 different households of 3 different levels of income, 15,000, 30,000 and 50,000. They had different consumption baskets because they had different utilities from consumption of goods. So, how do we really rank this? We rank it in terms of what we call as indifference curves. Okay. And what is this indifference curves? These curves are, representations of a combination of item, okay, when the consumer is at an indifferent situation. That is, certain combinations of goods would give me the same level of satisfaction. Yeah. Okay. What do I mean by that? I prefer to have idli and vada for breakfast. So, there is a combination of 2 idlis and 1 vada which will give me some level of satisfaction. There is also another combination, that is 1 idli and 2 vada, which could also give me the same level of satisfaction some days, right. So, I will then look at these preferences which are giving me the same level of satisfaction and then I will rank my preferences. Okay. And this is plotted into a curve and that is called the indifference curve. So let me put it a little more formally. Indifference curves then gives us the combination that produces the same level of satisfaction for the consumer, and higher indifference curves means higher level of satisfaction, lower indifference curves means lower level of satisfaction. So, please remember, a rational consumer then would try and move to higher indifference curve with the given income that is at his or her disposal. Okay. Now, let me show you a sample of this curve. These are some curves, IC1 and IC2. There are 2 IC1s that one is IC1 and IC minus 1. IC minus 1 is actually lower, yeah, in terms of satisfaction, whereas IC1 is higher and IC2 is even more higher, but unfortunately my consumer does not have the income to reach to IC2. Okay. Now we can have different combination of goods. For example, there is one combination of good called A, yeah, which is a combination of, you know, good M and good here in terms of, yeah, X and Y, yeah, where we have two different goods. So we find that there is one combination here called A, there is another combination of B, right, C, D. These are different combinations that I was talking about. Now please remember, all these different combinations would give the same level of satisfaction. So where do I place myself? I place myself depending on the prices of these goods. Yeah, please remember, I allocate my resource depending on the price. Then should I buy more of, see, both my earlier breakfast example shows that both gives me the same level of satisfaction, that is 2 idlis and 1 vada, or 1 idli and 2 vada gives me the same level of satisfaction. Now I allocate my resources depending upon the price of idlis and vadas. If vada is more costly, perhaps I will buy more idli. Very simple, straightforward kind of a reasoning there, and that is exactly what is these combinations that I am talking about, A, B, C and D, which are you know, plotted on these curves. Yeah, okay. So there are some properties, and that is just to keep in mind in terms of how this preference ranking works. It is downward sloping, we saw that. Yeah, that is what does it mean? It means that an increase in the quantity of a certain good, yeah, will have a decrease in the quantity of some other good, definitely. Yeah, these are convex to the origin. Yeah, that is, if you want to have more of one good, you have to, there is a trade-off, you have to give up some other good. Okay, they don't intersect because each one of those indifference curves represent different bundles of satisfaction. Yeah, so always the idea is to move to the highest possible curve. Yeah, okay, and you know, different curves show different levels of satisfaction. So higher the curve, higher the level of satisfaction. So as a consumer with limited income, consumers would like to move to higher and higher indifference curves. Now we don't go to the properties of this in depth because we want to take this to the understanding of markets. Okay,